All right, it looks like things are pretty stable, so we can go ahead and get started. So, hello to everybody that's just joined. Sorry if I'm repeating myself, but in today's webinar, we're going to be diving into the fascinating world of bees. Very fitting topic for a obesity webinar. This will include their diversity, their life history, the 7 different families of bees, how to easily distinguish between some common bee groups, and how to tell bees apart from wasps and flies. Presenting today, we have Anthony Colangelo, Pollinator Partnership Canada's Outreach and Education Specialist. He leads our Plan B project up north, where he's spent a lot of time out in the field identifying bees and the plants that they visit. So we're lucky to have him today to share this knowledge in this area. And if he was not busy enough, he also leads our Pollinator Stewardship Certification Training Program. This is an education program that we run annually from February into April. The training includes live virtual modules every week for 7 weeks. And they span a number of different topics, starting with the introduction to pollinators, to creating habitat across lots of different contexts, and then into how to educate your community about pollinators. And then after all of these training modules, you then engage in a habitat activity and an education activity, and then you can receive a certification through this. And I mentioned this because the presentation that you're hearing today is actually part of this PSC program. So if you're interested in learning more about the program, I'll include a link in a few minutes in the chat so you can check it out. Before I introduce Anthony, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land that Pollinator Partnership Canada resides on. We acknowledge that the land we're meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. That being said, I know we are participating today from all across Canada, so invite you to reflect on the land that you are on. Before I turn it over to Anthony, I'll take a minute to more formally introduce him. Anthony Colangelo is the Outreach and Education Specialist at Pollinator Partnership Canada. He is a biology enthusiast who spends most of his time taking photographs of the local bees and pollinators and uploading them to iNaturalist. He received his Bachelor of Science degree at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, majoring in biology, and has been working with Pollinator Partnership Canada for 8 years. Anthony leads the Pollinator Steward Certification Program, as well as the Plan B Community Science Program, studying plant-pollinator interactions in the Northern Canadian Territories. Anthony lives in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, and is excited to be working toward improving pollinator protection and health. I expect we'll have some time for questions at the end, so if anybody has questions, please type them into the Q&A, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. And with that said, that is enough from me. Let's turn it over to Anthony and learn about some bees.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction, Jordan. And thanks everyone for being here. I'm really excited to talk to you all about bees and how to identify the common bee groups found here in North America. So just a quick talk outline on what I'll be covering today. So I'll be going over bee diversity and life history. We'll be distinguishing major families of bees. Then we'll break things down into easy bee groups for monitoring when you're out in your own gardens. There'll be a short bee ID quiz at the end. We'll talk about some bee ID resources, and then there'll be some time for questions at the end. All right, so just so that we're all on the same page, let's go back and talk about who the pollinators are. So of course, pollinators are an extremely diverse and incredible group of animals and insects. We have our butterflies, we have birds, bats, wasps, moths, flies, and also some larger mammals like lemurs, sometimes flying squirrels, and even in tropical areas, lizards can sometimes act as pollinators. But of course, our most well-documented pollinators and some of the best pollinators that we have are the bees. So I have a picture of a colony of honeybees up here, and I think Generally, the first bee that we think about when we think about bees are the honeybee, which makes sense. They've gotten a lot of attention in the media and they play such an important role in our agricultural pollination, especially. But what I really want to get into today are the thousands of species of native bees and the thousands of species of bees that we have in North America that are commonly found. So, this is a great poster that we had commissioned at Pollinator Partnership a few years ago, just showing this incredible diversity of bees. So, you can see here they range in size and colors and shapes. So we have, of course, our large carpenter bees, which you can see at the forefront of this poster here, all the way down to super tiny bees, sweat bees, the fairy bees, and the bees that are even all metallic green, which is the metallic green sweat bee, and that's actually the official bee of Toronto, which is kind of a little fun fact. But I want to dig even deeper into why there are bees and who these bees are. And to do that, we need to go back in time about 150 million years ago. So here we have this slide at the T Rex. And no, there is no relation to T Rexes and pollination, unfortunately. That would have been really cool. But around this time period, let's go back to 150 million years ago and see what the ecosystem at this time looked like. So at this time, plants didn't have flowers yet, and they reproduced mostly by wind. Now, this was highly inefficient since the plants needed to release pollen in large amounts that would get dispersed in the wind and would be covering the sky in these pollen grains. And 99.9% of this pollen wouldn't find its target. So it wouldn't find the female reproductive organs of that same plant species. So a highly inefficient form of reproduction and pollination. But about 140 million years ago, plants started to develop structures called flowers, and this allowed for a more efficient form of reproduction. So the flowers would have content within the middle, so pollen, a stickier pollen, that would draw insects to it. And then those insects could then be the wings for those plant species. So one of the first pollinator groups that we've seen over the course of evolution are actually beetles. So beetles are some of the first pollinators that would visit flowers in these ancient plant species. And these flowers would resemble flowers that you would see today. So very similar to like magnolia flowers that you would see. And so where do bees come into the picture here? So of course, now we have plants with flowers, we have beetles, and maybe some other flying insects visiting those flowers. But let's talk about how bees evolved. So about 120 or 130 million years ago, there were wasps around. So similar to the wasps that we have today, they're carnivorous, so they're going after other insects that they would prey upon. But there's one particular predatory wasp that decided to switch her diet from eating other insects and meat to the pollen found in flowers. And when that type of wasp did that, she became the first bee. So bees evolved from wasps and are the vegetarian cousins of wasps. And over time, so over this 120 million years or so of coevolution and evolution, bees developed these highly specialized structures on their body to make pollination super highly efficient. So now, like in today's bees that we see, they're usually covered in hair, specifically specialized hair on their bodies called setae, that is really good at picking up pollen on flowers and transferring it from one flower to the next, and being those wings for the plants and helping them reproduce. And over again, this 120 million years, and through this coevolution now, we've created these incredible plant pollinator relationships that have just blown up the diversity of not only bees, but flowers as well. So now in today's biology, we have 20,000 different species of bees, and there's over 300,000 different flowers that rely on these bees for pollination. And similar to that poster that I showed, they come in all different shapes and sizes and colors. And I love this graphic that just shows how diverse bees are. So this is the large carpenter bee, which is commonly found in eastern Canada, and they are quite large in size. And they do like to kind of false bluff you. They're actually very gentle giants, but if you do get too close to their nest, they like to kind of like bears. They like to kind of false um, bluff and pretend that they're going to come attack you, but they're actually very friendly and super important pollinators just from the sheer size of them and how much pollen that they can collect. And so you can see here in this picture is the fairy bee that can fit on the eye of the eastern carpenter bee. And the fairy bee is the smallest bee that we have here in North America. And those ones are commonly found in the US in the Southwest. Then we have everything in between in terms of color, shapes, and sizes. And again, we got these metallic green sweat bees that are specifically super cool when you're in, when you're in Canada, in Toronto, and you get to see those bees flying around in the city where this is the official bee. And not only are they cool just from looking at them, just because of how different they are from one species to the next, but they are incredibly important for our ecosystems and our agriculture. So this is an interaction diagram, and I know it looks a bit complicated, but you don't need to memorize anything here. The only real thing you need to see is that this group here, the blue one in the middle, is our bees. And on the bottom here are the different flowers families that we have. And you can see that the blue bars are the largest. So just showing that bees interact with the most types of flowers that are in the landscape. So being really important for keeping our roadsides and our landscapes blooming with those beautiful, colorful flowers. And then again, so they're important for ecosystems, but for our agricultural systems as well, they're crucial. So this is another interaction map showing about 100 of our most important crops that we rely on for food when we eat. And again, on the right side, we have different pollinator groups with bees showing that they interact with the largest amount of the crops that we rely on for food. So now let's understand how bees live. So of course, when we think of bees, the first thing that comes to mind, I think, are large colonies, like our honeybee colonies or our bumblebee colonies. But most bees are actually solitary and live in the ground. So 70% of the bees that we have here in North America actually create nests underground. And so in this image on the left-hand side, you can see one of our mining bees. And mining bees create these like incredible structures underground. It's almost like a little condo system underneath the soil, with each little apartment being a room where that female bee will lay her egg. So each little apartment building will have one egg laid there, and the orange structure is a pollen ball. So the female bee will fly around to all the local native plants, collect pollen, and create this pollen ball that she'll lay an egg on. And then that pollen ball will be the main food source as that egg hatches. The larva grows and forms into an adult bee. So you can see this mining bee here has been pretty busy with quite a few different apartments in the underground condo there. And each one of those bees will eat those pollen balls and then mine their way out of the ground come next spring and take on the world and find flowers to pollinate. So lots of underground nesting bees. And then on the right-hand side, we have cavity nesting bees. So they'll find, old rodent burrows or pre-mined holes in wood and old stumps, or sometimes they'll even create their own holes in old wood as well. And similar to the mining bees, they lay pollen balls within that cavity, and then the larva will use those pollen balls as food as they develop into adult bees. Okay, so let's look at the three types of pollinators that often get mistaken as one another. So we have our flies, we have our wasps, and we have our bees. Now, this can take a bit of time to get used to. Even I find myself, even though I'm constantly looking at bees and pollinators every day, there are some really tricky species out there that often mimic each other. So we'll go through some key features right now so that you can become pro experts out there when you're monitoring your own gardens or you're looking for pollinators out in the landscape. So we'll start with flies. So I think flies are probably the easiest to tell. And there's a couple main features that I really want you to pay attention to, and that's looking at their head. So when you look at their head, the eyes that flies have are a telltale sign that they're a fly. So they have those large, buggy eyes that usually take up most of their head. And oftentimes their eyes are so big that they fuse in the middle of their head. So they got those big, buggy eyes and their antenna. Their antennae are often short and stubby. So if you see those large eyes and short, stubby antenna, it's most likely a fly. And then if you look at the rest of its body, flies only have 2 wings. So 2 wings, large, buggy eyes, short antenna, it's a fly. Then we have our bees. So bees, as I mentioned, have co-evolved with the flowers over millions and millions of years. And so they've developed these structures on their body that are highly efficient at collecting pollen. So they're usually pretty hairy, and they're usually carrying pollen on a certain part of their body that makes it really obvious that they've been visiting flowers and pollinating them. Bees have longer antennae, so whereas flies have those short, stubby ones, bees have nice, long antennae and usually smaller eyes that are just located on the sides of their head. They got wider back legs, and they have 4 wings. Then let's bring in the wasps. So again, wasps and bees can look pretty similar to each other. Again, they're cousins. Bees evolved from wasps, so there's a lot of similarities there. But wasps are, just from their diet, they're flying after other insects to catch them, and they're preying on other insects. So they need to be highly aerodynamic to maneuver the sky. So they're oftentimes not found with a ton of hair. They're aerodynamic. They're relatively hairless. If they do have hair, it's often pretty sparse, and they have these like sleek and slender look to them. That's the telltale sign that it's probably a wasp that you're looking at. They still have long antennae, but their legs are usually a lot thinner since they're not collecting pollen with those like specialized structures on their legs. All right, so that's kind of the crash course in how to identify these 3 different groups. And I hope that makes it a bit easier when you are outside looking at the different pollinators. And we are going to have a quiz in a little bit, so I'm hoping that you can remember these main features from when I put up those slides on bees, flies, or wasps. Okay, so why are there wannabes? Why are there types of pollinators that all look like one another? And this is called Batesian mimicry. And this is when a harmless species has evolved to imitate the warning signals of a harmful species, or a species that can cause harm to another organism. So in this case, we have bees and wasps, which are capable of stinging. But then we have flies, like in this previous picture here. This is a fly, you can tell again. Big buggy eyes, short antenna, 2 wings. This is a fly, even though it looks like it has the banding of a bee. So these flies use this Batesian mimicry to ward off predators. Since predators see that signal, they see that banding on them that makes them look like a bee. And then let's say birds or other smaller mammals that would eat these flies, they see that banding and they're like, oh, you know what, maybe I'm going to stay away because that organism could potentially harm me. So flies, harmless, but mimicking something that can cause harm. Batesian mimicry, super cool evolutionary trait that not just pollinators, but there's species in the whole animal kingdom that use this, and it's really fascinating. All right, so let's look at now some of the families of bees. Now, this might sound and look a bit complicated, but we'll break things down into easier groups as we continue along with this presentation. But just to put everything into perspective for you, let's look at these 7 groupings, these 7 families of bees that we have here in North America. So I'll start off with Apidae. And so this is the largest family of bees that we have in North America. And it includes species that you're probably all familiar with. It includes our honeybees and our bumblebees. But most of the species in this family are actually solitary. So each female bee is her own queen. And she does everything on her own, from going out and foraging on plants to laying eggs and helping those that larva develop into adult bees. So solitary bees are truly incredible of just the amount of work and things that they're able to get done. Many of these bees are important for crop pollination. So we want these, around our farms, helping pollinate our crops and pollinating the wildflowers in our crop rows and in the fields around our farms. Next, we have the Megachilidae. So this family might also have some bees that are familiar to you. So this includes our mason bees and our leafcutter bees. And what's interesting about this family of bees is that they carry their pollen, carrying hairs on the underside of their abdomen, so on the underside of their bellies. So oftentimes you can see these bees flying around and you'll see like bright orange on the underside of their bellies. And that's the pollen that they've collected for their own food, but also to create those pollen balls for their cavity nests. So as I just mentioned, most nest above ground in those cavities. And these are the bees that collect materials in their external surroundings. So like leafcutter bees, these are bees that'll be visiting, let's say, your rose bushes and going to the leaves and cutting out those perfect semicircular holes in your rose bushes and carrying those little leaf bits back to their nest to keep their larvae protected. And like mason bees, kind of similarly as their name suggests, they'll be using dirt and mud in their local surroundings and helping create their nests with that material and protecting their young with mud partitions. Another cool fact about Megachilidae is that these are the bees that you'll be attracting if you do create bee houses or hotels on your property. So you won't be bringing in honeybees or bumblebees, but most likely bees within this family that are using those materials in the landscape, visiting those cavities within those bee houses and hotels, and then creating their own little nest systems in there. Next up, we have Ingenidae. These are the mining bees. So as that diagram showed a few slides earlier with the underground condo system, these are those types of bees that like to nest underground and create those cool, complex nesting systems. So the interesting thing about mining bees is that they're usually the first type of bee that you'll see emerging in the spring or early summer. And they carry their pollen on their legs. So you can see in these pictures here, kind of like massive hind legs that are able to collect pollen. Many are specialists, which means that they'll only be visiting a certain type of flower, and they do have a reduced stinger. So even if they want it to sting you, it's not thick enough where it'll be able to puncture, human skin. Next, we have the Halictidae. So these are the sweat bees, and as their name suggests, are oftentimes found flying around us and landing on us in the summertime to lap up our sweat, since salt makes up a part of their diet, along with nectar and pollen. So many of the sweat bees are solitary, mostly ground nesting, and some of these are social, meaning that they can nest in aggregations around each other. And with the sweat bees too, they're often super tiny bees that often get mistaken as flies. So I do urge you to, go outside after this webinar or later this week or this weekend and look at the flowers in your garden, because oftentimes they're visiting your flowers and they're super tiny bees. And if you look closely, you will find them because they are a pretty common type of bee, the sweat bees. All right, and the final family of bee that I'll mention today are the Callididae. And so these are the plaster or polyester bees. So like their name suggests, the polyester bees create this substance to line their nests. It's almost like a plasticky film that they'll line their nests with. That comes from inside them, that they'll kind of like lay inside their nest, and that keeps their nest protected from any moisture, severe weather, and also keeps predators out. These types of bees can also be problem child sometimes because they can look like wasps, like this one here on the left-hand side. That is a masked bee. And unlike other bees, they're usually pretty hairless and they look very wasp-like. And this is because they consume pollen and or they collect pollen internally in a specialized crop, which they then use later. So they don't need to collect pollen externally on their body, but internally in that crop. So can sometimes be mistaken as wasps, but they have that telltale mask on their face and usually have a pretty, like their bodies are all black with just that mask on their face. Okay, so those are the families of bees, but now let's break it down into easier groups that are maybe a bit more digestible when you are outside looking at bees in your garden. So we'll break it down into 3 steps. Step 1, am I looking at a bee or is it a fly or wasp? If you've determined that it's a bee, let's go to step 2. Is it non-native or is it a native bee? So non-native, those are the honeybees here in North America. We can check that off. And then if it's a native bee, we have 4 categories here that we can classify them as. So it's either a bumblebee, a hairy leg bee, hairy belly bee, or other bee. And so those are the ones that are sometimes trickier to identify, but there's some tricks that we can go into. So number 1, the honeybee. So I think we're all pretty familiar with what honeybees look like, but they're often, you can often see them with hairy thoraxes or their chest area, and then their abdomens are generally less hairy, and they have this kind of golden banding along their abdomen. But the real telltale sign that what you're looking at is a honeybee is the pollen basket that it carries. So this is called the corbicula, and they carry wet pollen in these corbiculas. So whereas other bees will collect dry pollen on flowers, honeybees will actually mix the pollen with their saliva and pack it into these grocery bags on their legs. So you can usually see them flying around with these pollen balls on their legs, and they get so heavy that they're usually dragging their hind legs around when they're flying just because there's so much pollen packed on their legs. So if you see a bee flying around with their legs so heavy with pollen that they're drooping, you can see that hairy thorax with the golden banding on the abdomen. You're usually looking at a honeybee. And again, because honeybees are social creatures, they live in massive colonies. You're not usually going to see a honeybee all on its own. They're usually with a whole bunch of their sisters flying around, pollinating the local landscape that's relatively close to their hive. Next, we have bumblebees, and bumblebees I think are usually pretty easy to identify out in the field. I like to consider them as like the flying teddy bears of the bee world. They're compact and they're covered in that pollen collecting hair. And it almost looks like they shouldn't be able to fly just from how small their wings are in comparison to how large and fluffy their bodies are. But they are in fact very good flyers. And with bumblebees, so let's look at their life history a little bit here, but pretty common throughout all seasons of, all the warm seasons, spring, summer, and fall. But I do want to just take a second here to talk about just how interesting their life history is. So in the spring, usually those large bumblebees that you're seeing are queen bees. So if it's a large bee, you're probably looking at a queen, and they'll emerge having spent the entire winter underground alone. So up here in Yellowknife, where our winters are, 9 months, reaching temperatures of like negative 50 degrees Celsius, it's pretty incredible that these queen bees are able to hunker down and stay underground throughout that whole dark and cold period. All right, so in the spring, they're emerging. She's hungry, so she's going to go around, start flying around, collecting pollen from those local flowers, those early blooming spring flowers, and then she starts to create her brand new colony. Once that colony starts to get created, that first generation of worker bees will take over all that pollination work. So they'll be the ones, they're usually a lot smaller in size, and those worker bees will be the ones that you start to see flying around in the summer that are usually in abundance of numbers, while the queen kind of takes a rest and focuses on laying eggs and taking control of things within her little colony. Then by late summer and fall, we have multiple generations of bumblebees being formed. The future princesses are formed who will go out and mate before the winter, and then they'll hunker down again, all on their own to over the winter to then emerge in the spring to start their own colony. So Bumblebee colonies are actually annual, so they die off year after year, which is like just from the amount of bumblebees that you see outside. It's only the queens that survive from year after year, which I thought I didn't know until I started studying bumblebees, and I thought that was a really cool fact about them. And also about bumblebees, like I thought studying them that they're usually really easy to tell a bumblebee from a different type of bee group, but they're actually really hard to tell apart from each other, from one bumblebee species to the next. And now this is a different type of mimicry that I want to bring up, called Müllerian mimicry. So on this slide, the cool thing about this slide is that each one of these bumblebees is a different species, forming mimicry rings is what they're called. So each one of these looks pretty similar, but are just slightly different enough to be different species. And so this is called Müllerian mimicry. And what this mimicry does is it has two species that can both, defend themselves and cause harm, but they're using one pattern that creates this like mega pattern in a predator's eyes that really helps protect them from getting predated. So whereas Batesian was one harmless and one mimicking one harmful, this one has both that can defend themselves, but using a banding pattern that creates this mega banding pattern that really defends them from predators. So like a predator will see that orange banding on bees, that on bumblebees, that yellow and black banding, and be like, okay, this is something that might not be an easy snack. Maybe I'll move on to something else. And with bumblebees, so there's about 46 species I think we have here in North America, and there are some great resources that we have on our website so that you can get more familiar with the bee species that are common in your area. And so I think Jordan will be sending out a link after this webinar with a list of resources that have been mentioned in this webinar that can help you with your ID skills going forward. Okay, so we got the honeybees covered, we got the bumblebees covered. Now let's get to the hairy leg bees. So this includes our sweat bees, our carpenter bees, and our mining bees. And these are the bees that you'll see flying around collecting dry pollen, and again, collecting pollen on their legs. So whereas the honeybee was packing pollen in the corbicula, in that pollen ball, that wet pollen on their legs, these bees are collecting pollen on the entirety of their legs, almost so like it even gets up into their armpit almost, where their legs are so full of pollen. It's like just like super obvious that they've just been, really busy out in the landscape. So you can see here we have the metallic green sweat bee on the very left-hand side. That's packed all that pollen on her legs. And then we have the mining bee next to her. And so again, like distinguishing sweat bees from mining bees might take a bit of practice as you kind of continue with your ID journey. But if you generally want to classify these types of bees, you can classify them as the hairy leg bees. And again, very obvious once you see that pollen packed on their entirety of their leg. And then we have the hairy belly bees. So again, the leaf-cutting bees, mason bees, very obvious when you see like on the very left-hand side picture here, that leaf-cutter bee and that bright orange that you can see under their belly of that pollen that they've collected. And finally, we have the other bees. So these ones can be a bit trickier to identify because they often get mistaken as other types of insects. So these ones, again, I feel like as you continue along with your ID journey, these ones will become easier to identify, especially when you start to learn the landscape and what insects are common in your area. But the other bees include nomadic bees and parasitic bees. So these ones are mistaken as wasps because they, again, don't have a lot of hair on them, but they actually parasitize other bee species. So this female bee on this left picture here, this is a nomadic bee, parasitic bee, and she'll lay her eggs inside the nest of another bees. And then that larva of the parasitic bee will eat all the pollen balls that other species has collected, as well as the larva within that nest. And so those two species rely heavily on each other, but it seems like they would be bad, but it's actually a really important aspect of nature is having these parasitic species kind of keeping different, the other species populations all in line with each other. We have the masked bees that carry pollen internally, as I mentioned before. And here's another on the right-hand side, um, another type of parasitic bee that doesn't need to collect their own pollen since they're parasitizing other nests. Okay, so again, just as a review, we got what we're looking at. We figured out it's a bee. Is it native or non-native? Non-native is probably a honeybee. Is it native? Is it a flying teddy bear? Okay, it's a bumblebee. And then we look at where is it carrying its pollen? Is it carrying it on it? Is it carrying pollen on their legs or on the underside of their belly? Or are they one of those kind of weird species that looks like a wasp but is parasitizing other bee species or is carrying pollen internally? All right, so that was the crash course in BID, and it might seem like a lot of information right now and maybe a bit overwhelming, but I promise you, as you start to go outside, it becomes a lot easier, especially as you start to break it down into these, main categories. So we'll end off the session now with a fun little activity. We'll do is it a bee or not a bee? And we'll do a bit of a quiz. So on the following 7 slides, I want you to guess if the picture is a bee, fly, or wasp. Now try to refrain from putting your answers in the chat. Like, just keep your answers to yourselves. And at the end of the quiz, we can write in how many you got right. And I'm hoping that the majority of you are going to get a pretty good score on this quiz. So let's get to the first one. So is this a bee, fly, or wasp? All right, so this is a fly. All right, next one. Is this a bee, fly, or wasp? All right, this is a bee, a bumblebee. Bee, fly, or wasp? This is a bee. All right, how about this one? Is this a bee, is it a fly, or is it a wasp? So that is one of our hoverflies, also a very important pollinator. Oh, I forgot I added some tricky ones in here. Is this a bee, fly, or wasp? Yeah, this is a tricky one. This is a fly. This is a robber fly. How about this one? Bee, fly, or wasp? And I'm hoping you remember this from one of the previous slides, but this is one of the masked bees. Okay, and the last one, is this a bee, is it a fly, or is it a wasp? This is a wasp. All right, so put the amount of answers that you got right in the chat, and I'm curious to see how everyone did. Let's see here. Oh, nice. I see Marcus, 7 out of 7. Lynn, 5. Hillary, 5. 6 out of 7. 6 sevens. All but one. Nice job. Yeah, everyone did really well. Yep, 6 correct. Nice. Great job, everyone. Okay, I think I did an okay job then at describing how to tell the difference. But just again, here's that slide with the bee, fly, and wasp with their main differences. So again, the fly, you're looking at the head. Bees, hair, 4 wings, long antenna, and wasps, very aerodynamic. And here are some BID resources. So you don't need to read all this. We'll be sending you some follow-up resources to help you with your ID journeys. And a resource that I really enjoy using is iNaturalist, and I'm sure most of you have heard of iNaturalist or are using iNaturalist, but it's a really cool way to see which, not just pollinators, but just what wildlife is around your local community. And so for me, in particular, since I'm studying the bumblebees up here in Yellowknife, what I do is I just go into iNaturalist and I type in bees as the main species that I want to look at. And I type in the geographic range. So I type in Yellowknife. And then when I search that, I can see all the different bee species that have been found within my range. And if I'm not sure about what I'm looking at from my own picture outside, I can kind of see, like, okay, is there one that looks similar to the bee that I found? So that's if you want to try identifying yourself. But once you start to post to iNaturalist, there's so many incredible experts out there that are going through photos and helping people with their identifications. And even if you just post a picture without any identification, like you just have it labeled as B, I'm sure within a week or so, someone will be on there and help you with that identification. And then as you start to post more on iNat and contribute to this really important data and community science, the more you get better at kind of understanding what's in your local surroundings. And it is really fun, especially, I mean, when you start to see things that aren't as common and you post them on iNat and people get really excited, it becomes really addicting. And I absolutely love the aspect of just like that anyone can go outside and contribute to community science while finding really cool species. And to end off here, I always like to end off with the note of just enjoying the outdoors and the wonder of discovery. It really truly is incredible just how much biodiversity is out there if you just stop and listen for even just 1 minute. I know we live super busy lives and we got energetic lifestyles, but I urge you today or this weekend to just take a second in your own garden or take a second next to a patch of wildflowers on your commute to work or wherever you're going and just stop and listen and see if you can spot any of the cool bee species that we covered today. And my final slide is just a quick plug for PSC, as Jordan mentioned, our Pollinator Steward certification, which is a program that I run. If you did enjoy the information that you learned today, this program packs in so much information, basically everything you need to know to become a pollinator steward, an expert in pollinators. So it's a 7-part virtual training course that's open to the public. We cover everything from the pollinator basics to who the pollinators are to more technical workshops on how to actually install habitat in different landscapes, including your own home garden to large scale landscapes and agricultural landscapes. It's a course ideal for home gardeners, land managers, farmers, really anyone that wants to do more to support pollinators. And both individuals and organizations can get certified. So it's a really great program that I really enjoy leading, and registration will hopefully open this November. So keep an eye out for that. And with that, yeah, thanks for listening, everyone, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Anthony, for the great presentation. Very nice to see people getting five, sixes, and sevens on the bee flyer wasp quiz. Clearly, the idea tips are working. So I think we've got about 15 minutes for questions, and I see we've got some pretty good ones. So I'll start firing some questions off, and if anyone has more questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Um, One interesting one was, is there any AI for BID?
Yes, there is. And I think there was, I forget what the website was, um, but you could basically upload your photo and it would give you like a top three of what like they think it was. And it was using an AI based kind of like system. So there's definitely AI out there. But I do try to, even iNaturalist uses AI. So you can, it'll suggest what it thinks you have when you're uploading a photo. But I always like to try to take my first guess without using AI, and then I'll if I'm really unsure, then I'll revert to AI.
Nice. I think I used Bee Machine at one point. That might be what the
Bee
that
machine,
one
that's
was
the one.
called that
Yep,
gives the
yep,
top three, which is an awesome name.
yeah,
It was pretty accurate too.
yeah.
But then you need a good
Yeah.
picture. My pictures were terrible. So garbage in, garbage
And
out.
it was free Bee Machine, and I think now you might need to subscribe to it, which is why I
Ooh,
haven't used it in a while.
that makes sense. Like I used it
Yeah.
like 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Um, Another question, two kind of similar questions. Where do sweat bees make their nests, and where do bumblebees make their nests?
Yeah, good question. So bumblebees will nest in old rodent burrows underground. Oftentimes they make their nests under leaf piles. So leaving the leaves in the fall, I know I'm sure we've all heard that phrase at this point, is really important for bumblebee nesting because they'll make their nests under there, and also the queens will kind of like hunker down under the leaves and in the soil over the winter. So they'll make their colonies kind of like under shrubs, under the leaves, and sweat bees will nest underground as well. So they'll like have these like little tiny holes in the ground that they'll nest in.
Perfect. Uh, give you some low-hanging fruit potentially. What are the insects that buzz around food and drinks outside?
Yeah, so those are usually wasps and flies. And that's because wasps like to eat things that we have at our picnics. They're attracted to the foods that we eat. Um, but usually they're not bees that are coming around our picnics. Because again, like bees are more interested in the flowers. They're going to flowers for pollen and nectar in particular. But yeah, and flies as well. Like flies will eat kind of like the food that we eat too. So usually wasps and flies.
Perfect. Yeah, bees are friends, not foes. Um, this one's kind of a tough one. Uh, so this is back at the beginning when you were talking about the evolution. Did the original bee or the wasp like became the bee eat pollen, nectar, or both? Well, and I know we talked about the pollen, but that's a good question.
Yeah, I feel like it was mostly the pollen, but I have to look into actually when nectar had evolved in relation to pollen because nectar is a real big reward for a lot of pollinators. Like a lot of pollinators are going to flowers for that nectar reward. So um, definitely going for the pollen. I'll have to double check on when nectar kind of evolved in like as a reward in flowers.
Yeah, that was a good one. I'm curious about that too.
I do want to make a
Uh,
note too of the like when I had mentioned wasps and I know they can be a bit of a nuisance when they're um, visiting us during our picnics or outside, but I do want to mention that there's a ton of different wasps other than yellow jackets. There's a lot of solitary wasps, just like solitary bees, that kind of like really leave you alone and are kind of doing heroic work in our ecosystems. Like a lot of wasps take our beneficial insects that we want in our gardens that take care of like aphids and pest insects. So I know wasps, they can get villainized, but they do serve a really important purpose in the ecosystem. And same with flies, like our hover flies, especially as you move further north, like up here. We have so many hover flies that take over the pollinator game, and the larvae of hoverflies too eat a lot of pest insects. So yeah, more we need a better narrative for our wasps and our flies.
yeah, that's a really good point. I appreciate you making that clarification. Um, Another one, kind of from the beginning of the presentation, did you say that 300,000 flowering plants rely specifically on bees for pollination, or are there that many species that rely on insects more generally for pollination?
Yes, yeah, so those 300,000 species. So there's um, definitely bee pollination within those species, but then there's like other species will also visit those flowers as well because they're offering those rewards. So like there'll be flies or butterflies visiting those flowers at the same time. But the cool thing about bees is that they kind of vary in terms of generalists versus specialists. And so you'll have generalist bees like bumblebees that'll really fly to any flower that they can see in their spectrum that's offering those pollen and nectar rewards. Um, Versus the highly specialized bees, which are sometimes the really tiny ones that it's it gets to the point where it's like only a select few species of flowers that bee can visit. And those are the ones that are super tightly knit through coevolution, where they rely on each other. But there are a ton of flowers out there as well that, they are mostly pollinated by bees, but are also getting pollinated by other species as well.
Perfect. Uh, Interesting question. Are wasps and hornets in the same family?
So that's a good question.
Yeah, I'm just
I
kind of
feel like I need to
stumped.
touch up on my wasp family history, like within the wasp like world. Um, yeah, I think a hornet is a type of wasp, but maybe don't quote me on that. Maybe I need to get back to you on that one.
Yeah, yeah, me too. Um, oh, this is a good one. How do I know when I can register for Pollinator Steward certification?
Yeah, so if you go on our website, which I think Jordan dropped the link in the chat, you
Yep,
can sign up for our email list, and as soon as registration opens, I'll send an email to everyone saying that you can register. But also, if you check our social media channels, we'll be posting a lot on our socials when registration opens. But just off the top of my head, I'm thinking that we'll open up registration probably sometime in November of this year.
perfect. This one's a pretty good one too. Do carpenter bees make the holes in wood or use existing holes?
I believe they I believe they make the holes. Like I've seen them actually chewing out the holes in like wood. Um, so carpenter bees are an interesting one because we have the large carpenter bees and then there's the really tiny small carpenter bees, um, which also nest in cavities but aren't the ones that are super destructive. Now the large carpenter bees, again, they're one of my favorites. I haven't seen one in a long time since I moved away from Toronto, but they were always my favorites. Like in Toronto, when I would see them, just because they're huge, massive bees that just looked really cool. Now, if anyone is having an issue with carpenter bees, I have been told that by finishing the wood, like if you have furniture or like entryways that are wood, if you finish it with that like varnish, they don't like the smell of that product, and so they'll like leave that wood alone. You can also bait them with other, like, if you have dead stumps on your property or old wood that you put in like a pile, and if you have like a space on your property where you can just kind of leave it, they you can kind of bait them to go to that wood as opposed to like your wooden furniture on your patio. Um, but yeah, and then it just comes down to like being okay with just co-living with different species. Like I know my front deck, there's definitely a wasp nest underneath the deck right at our front door. And we've just been co-living in perfect harmony. Like they'll every time I step outside, they'll send a little scout just to see what's making noise. But they've never been aggressive. And so I've just kind of left them there to do their own thing. And if you can do that with the carpenter bees, I mean, that's always recommended that you just let them do their thing.
I appreciate the message of cohabitation. I believe in us to live with the insects. Um, this is a good one. How late in the season are bees nesting underground? In terms of when should people kind of refrain if they're going to dig in their garden? When would be safe to do that without disrupting bees?
Yeah, so it depends on the type of bee as well. So like each family bee that I mentioned will end its season at a different time. Um, so if you can, again, leave your gardens a bit messier, leave the leaves, leave your property, like, be a lazy gardener in the fall. You're benefiting all bee species. But I think a safe bet would be if there's still flowers out blooming and flowering, then you're probably safe to like, clean things up since the bees will still be active. But once those flowers go to seed and there's nothing really blooming anymore, then I think most things are starting to hunker down for the winter. And at that point, maybe don't disturb the soil and the leaves and things.
Perfect. I'm just looking through the list, and I think that might be all the questions. I saw some questions about when will we be able to watch the webinar. We did record it, so I'm going to be sending that out probably in a couple days. So you'll definitely be able to watch it on the YouTube page. Um, maybe I'll give 20 seconds if anybody has another question, because I see we've got a few minutes just in case somebody has something pretty pressing. Uh, just taking a look at the chat here. Oh, somebody asked, what are techniques to monitor bees?
Yeah, I love that question. So again, I'm going to point you towards iNaturalist. It's my favorite way of monitoring bees. You can download it on your phone, so it's like a really easy app, or it's also on your computer. But what I do is when I go for like my dog walks twice a day, I take my phone with me, and every bee that I see, or I almost try to like take pictures of every bee that I see, and I'll just take photos as I keep walking with my dog. And then once I get home, I'll upload all those to iNaturalist, and that's basically how I keep my record of all the bees that I've seen. Yeah, keeps it really easy, and then it does become a bit of a competition because then you're in a bit of a friendly competition with like your neighbors and the people who are in your same area that are looking at the same types of species. And again, once you find that rare species in your garden, a type of bee that's not as common, it really gets addicting, and it becomes even more fun. But yeah, iNaturalist is awesome.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to see the pollinators living in Yellowknife and the territories, it's amazing how many observations you've got up on those pages.
Yeah, we got observation. Yeah, I definitely, you know what, definitely check those out because we got observations now in all three territories through our Plan B project. So we got observations in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, observations in Whitehorse, Yukon, and now with this year, we got observations in Iqaluit, Nunavut. So really interesting bees living in the subarctic region.
Yeah. One more question I'll ask, which I think I know the answer. Someone's asking if they could use the slides during some of their presentations. I'm assuming no, because this is part of the PSC program, but just wanted to address the question.
Yeah, so the slides, what we do is for everyone who joins the PSC program, we provide a template outreach presentation, which has a lot of these slides in it as like a as like a benefit for joining to help with future outreach. So yeah, if you're able to join the program, we can definitely send you some slides that are part of the PSC.
Oh, that's great. I didn't even know that was a benefit that we offered. So that's fantastic. Um, I do see it is just about on the hour. So that is all the time we have. Thanks for all the awesome questions. Yeah, thanks so much, Anthony, for giving this really great overview of bee diversity and identification. Thanks to everybody who took the time to join and learn about bees. Hopefully, you learned lots about the different types that are out there. You can tell them apart from different flies and wasps, and maybe you're feeling empowered to get outside and make some observations, contribute to some iNaturalist projects. As I mentioned, the webinar is being recorded, so we're going to have that up on the Bee City Canada YouTube channel probably by Thursday. And I'm going to send out a follow-up email, and that'll have the recording, and it'll also have links to plenty of other resources that Anthony mentioned that you can use to learn more about bees. So that concludes today's webinar. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and stay tuned for the next one. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.